welcome to the study. Today we're going back to the Regency era in London. We're going to look at Regency Britain's possibly most notorious figure, the Prince of Wales. George, Prince of Wales, or the Prince Regent, the future King George IV, or sometimes known as Prinny, or the Fat One. Here I have fashions for July 1811, and we've got a long report of the Prince Regent's fete. The decorations, the dances, the dinner, the attendants, and of course what everyone wore. So we're going to have a look at this fete with a little bit of architecture, history, and some 18th century gossip. So get your fluffy pillow, settle down, and prepare to be transported back in time to 1811. On February 5th, 1811, George, Prince of Wales, was declared Regent of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. George had been waiting a very long time for his chance to be monarch of Great Britain. His father, King George III, had suffered from a mania for many years, and occasionally there had been talk of a regency. But the king never remained fully incapacitated long enough for such to eventuate. But in 1810, however, the king's health took a final plunge. Within a few months, Prince George was authorized to act as regent with the powers of king. What was it then that the new regent did first? He threw a grand party. 2,000 of Prinny's closest friends were invited to an evening fete on the 19th of June at Carlton House in Pall Mall. Certainly, for PR reasons, it was announced that the party was being held to mark the King's birthday, which fell on the 4th of June, and to honour those members of the French Louis XVIII and his family in exile from France. But it was really a celebration of George's ascent to power. This lavish event would set the tone of Regency-era high society. Carlton House derived its name from Henry Boyle, Baron Carlton, who owned the property in the early 18th century. The house eventually passed into the ownership of Frederick, Prince of Wales, the son of George II and the father of George III. In 1783, the future George IV, then Prince of Wales, came of age, and he was given Carlton House in which to form his own household. By this time, it was badly in need of renovation, and George III obtained a grant from Parliament to make Carlton House a suitable residence for his son. The architect Henry Holland was employed to remodel Carlton House. However, the prince's expenditure was always far in excess of his funds, and he ran up huge debts on this and other building projects, and was ultimately forced to marry in order to persuade Parliament to release more funds. The prince's building projects seemed to go on forever. He was continually remodelling Carlton House and redecorating the rooms. After Holland's death, he employed a variety of other architects to help him realize his ever-changing vision. Thomas Hopper added the Gothic conservatory, whilst James Wyatt and John Nash completely remodeled the lower story. Edward Wyatt added carved and gilded doors, and Walsh Porter added sumptuous draperies and wall hangings. Many parties took place there too, and it was even home to the Carlton House set, the Prince's own in-crowd. In 1813, Carlton House was described as a centre for all the great politicians and wits who were the favourites of the Regent. In the volume 4 of Old and New London, originally published by Cassell, Petter and Galpin, London 1878, Carlton House is described in Chapter 8. It reads, "The north side of the Mall, in St. James's Park, is nearly all occupied by the lofty mansions of Carlton House Terrace. They cover the site of Carlton House, the palace of Frederick, Prince of Wales, father of George III, and subsequently for many years the residence of George IV when Prince of Wales. The house was distinguished by a row of pillars in front, whilst York, now Dover House, Whitehall, the residence of the Prince's brother the Duke of York, was marked by a circular court serving as a sort of entry hall, which still remains. The house itself stood opposite what is now Waterloo Place, looking northward, and the forecourt was divided from Pall Mall by a long range of columns, handsome in themselves, but supporting nothing. This screen or colonnade of single pillars, with the long line of cornice or entablature which raised upon them, formed a disagreeable impediment to the view of the front of the palace. When I first saw England, writes Thackeray in the Four Georges, she was in mourning for the young Princess Charlotte, the hope of the empire. With my childish attendant I remember peeping through the colonnade at Carlton House, and seeing the abode of the Prince Regent. I can yet see the guards pacing before the gates of the palace. What palace? The palace exists no more than the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. It is but a name now. The prince liked to have pictures painted of his royal residences, and many of the rooms are included in Pine's 1819, A History of the Royal Residences. Master engravers William James Bennett and William Henry Pine made engravings of the opulent interiors in great detail and in colour, with a floor plan as well. However, it is sometimes difficult to match the descriptions with the rooms, as George would change the names of the rooms whenever he redecorated. With its many renovations by talented architects and designers, and despite its opulent vulgarities, and being the venue for many banquets and parties, Carlton House was possibly the most important house of its time in Britain. When the prince married Charlotte's mother, Caroline of Brunswick, in 1795, she was given apartments in Carlton House. Princess Charlotte was born at Carlton House on the 7th of January, 1796. When the royal couple fell out with each other in 1798, Caroline moved out, but Princess Charlotte continued to reside in the nursery rooms, located on the upper floors. The architect John Nash would continue to make costly improvements during the Regency and beyond. One of the main reasons for a particularly expensive renovation was George's celebration of his regency with a grand fete. When the Prince of Wales took the oath by which he became regent on 6th February 1811, he he desperately wanted to throw an extravagant grand party to celebrate his new power. However, the reason why he was made regent, his father's lapse into mental illness, was not really a cause for celebration. So, in consultation with his current mistress, Lady Hertford, they planned the grand fete outside the public eye, so as not to appear insensitive. It was fortunate that the king's birthday would be a good pretense for the party, and they could also invite members of the French royal family on exile in England, thus ensuring it would be a grand and official state occasion. The king's birthday was the 4th of June, and the fete was originally scheduled for that date, but due to the king's failing lucidity, and not the least because of many of the decorations the Prince Regent had ordered were not yet ready, the party date was postponed. More than 2,000 invitations by ticket were sent out for the most prestigious event of the year. The event drew many of the aristocratic, artistic, and political elite. The opposition Whig party leadership was represented as well, and they attended Carlton House with high hopes of replacing the government of Spencer Perceval once the restrictions imposed on the Regency expired after a year and the Prince gained the full powers of the monarch. Whigs in attendance included Samuel Romilly and George Tierney. During Tierney's early years in Parliament, he was known for his radical views and was a supporter of Charles James Fox. The French Revolution of 1789 was a polarizing force in British Whig politics, with some supporting the revolution and others such as Edmund Burke strongly opposed to it. When Fox seceded from the House of Commons, Tierney emerged as one of the most prominent opponents of William Pitt's foreign policy. In May 1798, Pitt accused him of want of patriotism. A duel ensued at Putney Heath on Sunday, 27th of May, 1798, but neither combatant was injured. Other guests included the Duchess of York, wearing a patent net dress richly embroidered in silver and covered in diamonds. Also in attendance was the Prince's old friend George Bryan Beau Brummel, the last time he was invited by the Prince Regent to a social function. Notable absences included Maria Fitzherbert, whom George had illegally married in 1785. Her relationship with the Regent was by this time very strained, owing to the ascendancy of Lady Hertford. When she discovered that Lady Hertford had been granted a seat at the Prince's table and she had not, she refused to attend. George was long estranged from his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, Princess of Wales, who was then living separately in Blackheath, and was also not invited. Caroline forbade Princess Charlotte, who was still quite young, from attending, and Caroline sent her to Windsor to stay with her grandmother, Queen Charlotte, who herself was outraged by her son's celebration while her husband was still suffering. Queen Charlotte stayed away and also ordered her 5 unmarried daughters not to attend. On the night of the party, by 8 o'clock, lines of coaches carrying guests stretched down Pall Mall and St. James as far as Bond Street and Haymarket, crowding the streets with carriages. Though it was a warm night, the guests were dressed in their finest. In a show of support, perhaps, and no doubt a result of the ongoing war with France, the Regent had requested that guests don articles of British manufacture, contributing to the burgeoning success of St. James tailors, manufacturers and suppliers. Pawnbrokers lent out diamonds and precious stones for the occasion at 11% interest. The Regent's royal brothers and their wives, as well as some of the principal nobility and high-ranking military officers, had arrived early. Generals Keppel and Turner, Colonels Bloomfield, Thomas and Tyrwhitt, along with Lords Moira, Dundas, Keith, Heathfield, and Mount Edgecombe, made up the receiving line. Once inside the main hall, the guests passed through a double line of the yeomen of the guard in their red dress livery into the octagonal salon, which had been transformed into a floral bower. From there they spread through the staterooms and spilled out back into the garden, illuminated by thousands of shimmering lights and filled with flowers, ornamental shrubs, and miniature fruit trees, and bands were playing in each of the tents. Moving among the guests were the prince's servants, dressed in a dark blue livery trimmed with gold lace, as well as many of the king's and queen's servants pressed into service for the evening and wearing the state liveries of black suits with white vests. There was also one man circulating through the crowd wearing a full suit of medieval armor. The prince entered the staterooms at about 9:15. He was wearing false side whiskers and a long curled wig. He was dressed in the uniform of a field marshal, a rank to which he had promoted himself upon becoming regent. The uniform, of his own design, featured red velvet tunic, heavily embroidered with gold and decorated with the Order of the Garter over a sturdy corset, and glittering diamond-encrusted star. In addition, the prince carried a jeweled, gilded sword. This gaudy new uniform seemed to break every code of elegant dress which Beau Brummel had tried to impart to him. Brummel was indeed present that evening. The French royal family arrived at about 10, and the prince received them in a state reception room hung with blue silk and decorated with golden Bourbon fleur-de-lis. He welcomed the Comte de Lille, as Louis XVIII styled himself while in Britain, and his younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, future Charles X, as well as their niece, the Duchesse d'Angoulême, and her husband. Many guests indeed attended that night just to see the Duchess, for she was the only surviving child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Also in attendance was the Duc de Berry, the Duc de Bourbon, Prince de Condé. The Prince Regent led the Bourbon Royal around the richly decorated Carlton House as a private citizen, showing him the state apartments and the gardens and all of the lavish decorations. Dancing began at midnight. 2 rooms had been set aside for dancing in. Around the edges of the ballrooms, a number of conversation stools were placed for those who chose to watch rather than to dance. Several newspapers provide us with some descriptions. The Times newspaper, for the 21st of June, 1811, writes, "The ballroom floors were chalked in beautiful arabesque devices. In the center of the largest were the initials G3R. It was divided for 2 sets of dancers by a crimson silk cord. One of the windows being taken out had in the recess an orchestra which diffused its melodies throughout the apartments. The anteroom adjoining was also set apart for dancing, the doors of which being kept open, one band in the drawing-room was sufficient for both. The floor of this room was very neatly ornamented. In the centre was the Prince Regent's crest, the feathers, in various colours, surrounded by musical notes, musical instruments, particularly those used in dancing, and various other devices. But owing to the great number of persons and the excessive heat of the weather, no dancing took place in this room, nor were the dancers numerous in the ballroom. The Morning Post of the 22nd of June, 1811, writes, "At about 10 o'clock, dancing commenced in the council chamber. Mr. Gower's excellent band attended for the purpose. From the crowded state of the room, however, dancing was shortly discontinued, contrary to the wishes of the prince, who used every exertion to set it on foot again. There was only one dance more during the remainder of the evening, the company appearing to prefer the promenading from one room to another, and gazing on the dazzling brilliancy which shone through the superb palace." The Morning Post for the 21st of June, 1811, had listed the entire programme of dances, identifying the dancers. The first couple who tripped on the light fantastic toe were Earl Percy and the accomplished and deservedly celebrated beauty, Lady Jane Montague, the daughter of the Duchess of Manchester. They led off with a dance called Miss Johnstone. Next followed Lord Maitland and the Duchess of Bedford, Earl Tyrconnell and Lady Catherine Herries, the Earl of Digby and the Countess of Jersey, Sarah Villiers, Countess of Jersey, whose mother-in-law had been a mistress of the prince, was one of the patronesses of Almack's, the most exclusive social club in Regency London. Next, the Marquis of Worcester and Lady Charles Somerset. Then Lord Palmerston and Lady Frances Pratt, Lord Edward Somerset, who at Waterloo in 1815 lost his hat during the first cavalry charge, and in the subsequent search for it, a cannonball tore off the flap of his coat and killed his horse. He was with Lady Charles Fitzroy. Then Lord Charles Somerset and Miss Metcalfe, Earl of Kinnoul and Lady Mary Edgecombe, Lord Lake and the Honourable Miss Onslow. Next, Lord Mark Carr, an interesting man, an officer of the Royal Navy, who was present at the capture of Minorca in 1798. Captain Carr was appointed to HMS Fusquard in September 1804, and a month later he captured several Spanish ships worth more than £14,000. On the 2nd of November 1804, Horatio Nelson, himself quite ill, wrote to Lord Melville, "I fear Lord M. Carr is falling into the same complaint as I have. I have now got him to the fleet, and shall keep an eye upon him, for he is too valuable an officer and a good man to be lost for want of care." In April 1805, Captain Mark Carr discovered that the French Toulon fleet, sought by Nelson, were in the Atlantic, and he passed this information on to Vice Admiral John Ord, who relayed the message to England, and we all know it eventually resulted in the Battle of Trafalgar. Mark Carr danced with Lady Elizabeth Clive. Next came Earl Gower and Miss Glynn, Colonel McMahon and Miss Methuen, Lord Milsington and Miss Faulkner, Earl of Roth and Miss Thompson, and Mr. Lloyd and Lady Cholmondeley. The Prince Regent and the Royal Dukes of York, Clarence, Kent, Cumberland, Cambridge, and Sussex were present at this period, 11:30, and appeared highly gratified to see so enlivening a scene. "Strike up, musicians, my old favourite and Scottish tune," exclaimed the Prince. These were admirably played and equally well danced by the Dukes, who are decidedly among the best performers in the polished circles of high life. The crowding and heat resulted in only those two dances, Miss Johnstone and the Scottish air, "I'll gang nae mair to you, town," being performed all evening. Both favourites of the Prince, and performed by the celebrated Gow Band. The Edinburgh-based Nathaniel Gow was perhaps the most successful band leader of the Regency era. Due to the overcrowding, however, quadrilles are thought not to have been danced. Outside, covered walks had been specially constructed as promenades and supper galleries. The aisle opposite the conservatory was furnished with large looking-glasses and girandoles and candelabras, and the walkways were decorated with garlands of flowers, and bands played music in the 4 marquees erected on the lawn. Then there was a brilliant fireworks display. At 2:30 in the morning, supper was served. The Prince's table was laid in the Gothic conservatory, and was nearly 200 feet long, the entire length of the room. A huge water feature had been installed, giving the effect of a stream running the length of the room and filled with fish, and edged on the banks made of mosses and flowers. Multiple courses were served to guests while a musical band, concealed in the garden, played throughout the meal. There was magnificent gold dinner service made by the royal goldsmiths, Rundell and Bridge, which had taken several years to create and cost over £60,000. It became known as the Grand Service and is still used for state occasions today. The Regent sat at the head of the main table in a crimson velvet-covered mahogany throne edged in gold, with the Prince of Wales's feathers carved into its back. On his right was seated the Duchess of Angoulême, and his left the Duchess of York. Further along the table were seated the other members of the French royal family, and the royal English dukes and their wives. Then came his current mistress, Lady Hertford, her husband and their son, Lord Yarmouth, as well as 400 more guests. The remaining 1,600 guests took their supper at the lavish buffet, which had been set up under the flower-ornamented marquees in the garden. The meal comprised hot soups and roasted meats, various hot dishes, and cold sliced meats, cheeses, peaches, grapes, pineapples, strawberries, and many other fruits and berries which, not being in season at the time, were quite exotic and difficult to obtain. Champagne was on ice between every 3 to 4 people, and there were many excellent wines. There was plenty of food prepared by the best cooks in Europe, and no rushing or crowding, as the 2,000 guests were able to enjoy the meal and take their time. Supper lasted for several hours, with the first of the guests drifting away shortly after 4, but many remained until after dawn, strolling the gardens or slipping into the conservatory to see the sights of the main table. The Prince Regent's head chef, Jean-Baptiste Wattier, so famous in the Regency set that a club was later named after him, supervised the preparation. Desserts were provided by the Duchess of Dorset's expert confectioner, who had been loaned for the occasion. The guests at the Prince Regent's table were attended by 60 servants dressed in their blue liveries and gold lace, including the man in the medieval suit of armour. The fete continued into the early morning, the last guests, including the Irish poet Thomas Moore, leaving at 6 o'clock in the morning. The Prince Regent opened Carlton House over the following 3 days to allow the public to view and admire the decorations and the aftermath of the grand fete. Though these open days were advertised as by ticket only, estimates are that more than 30,000 people thronged to Carlton House, filling both Pall Mall and the Haymarket with the overflow. This large crowd became unruly, pushing and shoving one another in an effort not to be excluded from this magnificent spectacle. There were many cries and shrieks heard, causing Lord Yarmouth, Lady Hertford's son, to come forward and speak to the crowd, attempting to quiet them before the gates were opened. Nevertheless, many rushed forward as the gates swung open, and a number of people were severely injured by the pressure of the surging crowd. Both men and women lost hats, bonnets, tippets, and coats. Many women were so mauled by the densely packed mass of people that they even lost their shoes. Their hair was pulled down, and some even had their gowns torn from their bodies, to be left in nothing but undergarments, or sometimes less. A few days later, some of the London newspapers advised the public that there were great tubs at Carlton House filled with lost and discarded shoes, as well as heaps of bonnets, shawls, hats, and coats which had all been lost by those caught in the Carlton House crush. The Prince Regent was so horrified by this turn of events that he vowed never to let such a thing happen again, and it is believed that this marked the beginning of the prince's diminishing pleasure and affection for his London palace. The Morning Post newspaper shared an extended editorial about the fete over 3 consecutive issues, and other newspapers also published juicy details and elaborate descriptions of the fete. Though the papers described the fete as a brilliant evening and a display of magnificence, the British economy was suffering from wartime inflation and high unemployment. The Prince Regent's profligacy was seen in sharp contrast to the widespread poverty of the nation. The extravagance of this Regency fete epitomized the prince's lifelong love of excess. The poet Shelley remarked, "What think you of the bubbling brooks and mossy banks at Carlton House? It is said that this entertainment will cost £120,000, nor will it be the last bauble which the nation must buy to amuse his overgrown bantling of Regency." How admirable this growing spirit of ludicrous magnificence tallies with the disgusting splendours of the stage of the Roman Empire which preceded its destruction. Yet here are a people advanced in intellectual improvement, wilfully rushing to a revolution, the natural death of all great commercial empires, which must plunge them into the barbarism from which they are slowly arising. In fact, Shelley was so disgusted by this fate that he perceived it to be a wasteful extravagance, that he wrote a 50-line poem titled "On a Fete at Carlton House." He had it printed up in pamphlet form, and amused himself on many evenings in the following weeks tossing copies of this poem into the carriages of those who were on their way to Carlton House. there were many copies of this poem printed, but none are known to survive. The fete was also not without its fun and pranks. The rake and writer Theodore Hook used this fete as an occasion to play a practical joke on his friend, the flamboyant actor Romeo Coates. Hook happened to be a talented forger, and when he got hold of one of the invitations for the fete, he created a counterfeit invitation that was addressed to Coates, who was so delighted to receive it that he had a glorious scarlet uniform made for himself, just for the occasion. On the night of the fete, he dressed in this new costume, complete with a diamond-hilted sword, and had himself driven to Carlton House in his custom-made carriage, which was ornamented with a crowning cock. Hook stationed himself at the entrance to Carlton House to watch his joke play out. Coates alighted, dismissed his carriage, and was admitted into the main hall. There it was that he had to show his invitation to the private secretary of the Prince Regent. The secretary immediately recognized the invitation as a forgery. Coates was politely informed of the mistake and was asked to leave. But he had already dismissed his carriage, so he was forced to walk to the nearest stand of hackney coaches in his bright scarlet uniform, and Hook, trailing behind him, laughing at his poor friend's misfortune. The following morning, however, the Prince Regent learned what had happened to this actor Romeo Coates, and expressed his great regret that he had been turned away, since he was an inoffensive and amusing gentleman who would have entertained many of the guests. The prince sent his private secretary to Coates immediately to apologize in person and to proffer personal invitation from the regent, so that he could come and view the decorations and ornamentation of the fete, which were all still in place. Coates accepted happily, and thereby received a private tour of Carlton House. Whenever Hook related the story later, he is said to have shown signs of remorse for the trick he played upon his friend. Though Princess Caroline was not invited, despite being the regent's wife, he invited all members of her household. In a show of very good form, however, she told them that they should go, and that they should accept the regent's invitations. To ensure that they did not feel disgraced as members of the princess's household, she made a gift to them each of a full suite of clothes, or a new dress especially for the fete, and all of her ladies went to Carlton House in the princess's own carriage. Mrs. Fitzherbert, whom the prince had secretly married before but then fallen out with, did receive an invitation. She was but one of the figures that was prominent in the Prince Regent's life, and very loyal to him as well, whom he also slighted. Hurt and humiliated, she refused to attend, so the prince ordered her to. Still she did not. But then later, the Prince Regent did send her a dress as a peace offering. Mrs. Fitzherbert, however, did attend a grand ball given at Devonshire House the evening after the Prince Regent's fete at Carlton House. It was here that she saw the Prince Regent for the last time in her life. as he was also attending, with his current favourite, Lady Hertford. The Duchess of Devonshire was very fond of Mrs. Fitzherbert, and protected her from the prince's slights. Another of the Prince Regent's friends was George Brian Brummel, known as Beau Brummel. Beau Brummel had been part of the Prince Regent's China Regiment. The 10th Hussars were called the China Regiment because they never saw action, and they were known as the best dressed regiment in the British Army. It is even said that Beau Brummel got the idea for his suit designs for men's suits partly from the uniforms worn by the Hussars of the 10th. Beau and the Prince Regent had a long-standing relationship since then, and Brummel was often invited to the Prince Regent's parties, social events, and the Prince attended Beau's dressing parties, taking his lead from Brummel's fashion advice, and forming a group of dandies, young, well-to-do men who set the fashion for Regency London and were full of witty remarks. Beau Brummel was known for his witty remarks about everyone but including the prince, and occasionally would make a jibe about the prince's weight. The fact was that the prince was simply not capable of the constancy that his friends showed him in turn, and happened to be a very fickle and flamboyant character. Beau Brummel was always receiving slights from the prince. There was an incident when the prince had come to watch Brummel dress, with all of the dandies present. He expressed admiration for one of Brummel's snuff boxes, the expectation being that Brummel would gift it to him, but he did not. The Prince Regent was very sensitive about his growing corpulence, and also sensitive that his newfound regency power was still limited by Parliament, which is why perhaps he took it rather badly when Brummel once remarked that he could bring the old king back into fashion. In the style of Cicero, who audaciously made a similar comment about Augustus, Beau Brummel was insinuating that he had made the Prince Regent fashionable and could just as easily unmake him. The prince was cut by this remark and felt threatened by this comment, and as a result Brummel was never again invited to any of the prince's social events. As a revenge for this banishment from the Prince Regent's society, Beau Brummel and 3 of his dandy friends, including Lord Alvanley, Henry Pierpont, and Henry Mildmay, planned a masquerade ball at the Argyle Rooms in July of 1813, and Beau insisted that the Regent not be invited. However, the prince learned of the upcoming ball and wrote forthwith to announce that he would attend. Well, the gentlemen organisers had no choice but to send him an invitation. On the night of the ball, the 4 gentlemen hosts were all in the receiving line at the entrance to the Grand Argyle rooms. The Prince Regent arrived and bowed very cordially to Pierpont, and as he turned to see Beau, he blanked him and turned past him to Alvanley. Beau Brummel was taken aback and found this an occasion for another of his witticisms. He turned to Alvanley and said, "I say, Alvanley, who's your fat friend?" Those present didn't think much of this remark. It was not out of the ordinary. However, the prince took it very hard, especially as he was growing in weight all the time and was sensitive about it. He was gravely wounded by this cut by Brummel and never forgave him, and the two never spoke again. The cost of the Carlton House Fete was criticised by many in Parliament. Both parties took part in this criticism, and also the public. The fete was seen as yet another outrageous excess by a man already deeply in debt. Was there anything to curb the Prince Regent's spending? Many complaints of lavish expenditure and the puerile taste of a serpentine tabletop stream stocked with gold and silver fish, giant gilt tent ropes, and indoor bowers and grottos were spoken about for weeks. But eventually, all that remembers was this glittering social event, more splendid than any other within living memory. Across London, little else was talked of for weeks. People spoke of the beauty of the women, their dazzling jewels, stunning gowns, and of the splendor of the decorations at Carlton House, the magnanimous royal hospitality of the Prince Regent. The Carlton House Fete was to set the tone for the new aesthetic spirit of the Regency, and it amplified theatricality as well as lavish, conspicuous consumption, which were to become the hallmarks of the reign of the Prince Regent. The fete did not cost quite £120,000 that Shelley had estimated, but it was still extremely costly. The Prince Regent's expenditures, however, and extravagant balls would continue, unchecked and uncontrolled, as well as his selfish disregard for the well-being of his people, that made him one of the most despised monarchs in British history. The Regent continued to host major receptions at Carlton House over the decade coming, and the victory celebrations at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, including the Allied sovereign's visit to England in 1814, all took place at Carlton House. By 1815, the prince was losing interest in this house, and after his mother's death in 1818, he announced his intention of moving to Buckingham House at the end of the Mall. On the death of his father in 1820, he became King George IV and turned his attention to renovating and enlarging Buckingham House as his primary London residence. It would then become Buckingham Palace after one of its many renovations and additions, with the U-shaped court fronted by the triumphal arch, now Marble Arch. In an effort to raise money for this new and expensive project, George gave up Carlton House completely in 1826, stripping it of its furniture and fittings for reuse in Buckingham Palace. Much of the decoration and furniture moved to his pavilion at Brighton as well. This coincided with alterations to the planning of Regent Street, the fashionable end for London's high society, and, in order to link Regent Street with the Mall, Carlton House was demolished. Nash was to embark on a grand project to build Carlton Terrace in its place, comprising the Duke of York Steps and the twin Carlton House terraces which still stand today, housing, among many diplomatic houses, politicians, and personages over the years, the British Academy and the Royal Society, looking much as they did during the reign of George IV. George did not moderate his habits after he inherited the throne in 1820. He died in 1830 at the age of 67, his health ruined by his overindulgence, having been the key to setting the tone of Regency London with his grand fete at Carlton House. It's been wonderful to have you here, my friend, to join me in the study for the Prince Regent's Carlton House Fete. I hope that you will have a deep, restful, peaceful night. Be good to yourself. Be kind to others. And as always, be extraordinary.